Family transparency is a dangerous myth. Most men believe sharing everything strengthens bonds, but that's precisely backwards. Every revelation shifts the power dynamic, sometimes irreversibly. The most respected patriarchs understand selective disclosure. You're 65, not 25. Your words carry weight that reverberates through generations. Humans instinctively use information as currency, even loved ones. These 5 boundaries aren't about secrecy, they're about wisdom. The responsibility to protect certain truths isn't just for your dignity, it preserves the very family structure you've spent decades building. Many will tell you that sharing builds closeness, that honesty creates intimacy. But there's a profound difference between honesty and total disclosure, a distinction most men never learn until it's too late. I've seen it countless times in my clinical practice. The patriarch who believes his financial vulnerabilities should be an open book, only to watch respect erode beneath his feet. Let's start with perhaps the most dangerous thing you should stop sharing immediately. The complete picture of your financial struggles reveals more than numbers. It exposes your competence in the eyes of those who've always seen you as the provider. I remember working with Robert, 72, who proudly announced every investment mistake to his children, believing this transparency was wisdom. 6 months later, his son was helping manage his accounts, and his daughter was questioning his ability to live independently. The power had shifted irreversibly. What's happening here is fundamental to human hierarchies. Financial security signals competence in our primitive brain structures. It's not just money, it's credibility. Jung spoke about the archetypal father representing security and order. When you undermine this archetype in yourself, you trigger unconscious anxiety in your family system. They don't consciously want to see you differently, but psychological structures override intention every time. Consider instead the selective disclosure approach. This isn't about deception, it's about discernment. You can acknowledge challenges without broadcasting vulnerability that serves no constructive purpose. When Robert began framing financial discussions around the lessons rather than the losses, the dynamic shifted. He'd say, "I've adjusted my approach to include more dividend stocks rather than I lost 20,000 on that tech company." Same reality, different framing, entirely different psychological impact. The primitive brain doesn't distinguish between financial insecurity and existential threat. When you share money worries, your family doesn't just hear numbers, they hear danger. Their reactions aren't really about your finances, they're about their own security being threatened. And once that perception takes hold, it's extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Now, this doesn't mean isolation with your challenges. That creates a different kind of suffering altogether. What it means is finding appropriate channels, financial advisors, male peers in similar life stages, support groups specifically designed for retirement transitions. These contexts allow problem solving without the complex family dynamics that distort both the advice you receive and how you're perceived afterward. The deeper truth is that your family needs you to maintain certain boundaries, not for your dignity alone, but for the stability of the entire family system. Children and grandchildren, even adult ones, are watching how you handle vulnerability. They're learning from you whether age brings wisdom or defeat. Your disclosure patterns are teaching them how to age. What's truly remarkable is how quickly perception shifts once you implement this boundary. I've seen men who were being subtly infantilized by concerned children suddenly treated with renewed respect when they shifted from sharing struggles to sharing strategies. The family system recalibrates around your confidence, not your content. The sharing of resentments and unresolved conflicts, particularly those that have festered for decades, represents one of the most insidious traps for men in their later years. I've observed this pattern repeatedly. A father believes that finally getting things off his chest about old family wounds will bring relief. Instead, it often creates new fractures that prove impossible to repair. Consider Richard, 68, who decided his daughter's 40th birthday dinner was the appropriate moment to detail how his sister-in-law had undermined him 30 years prior. He felt unburdened. Everyone else felt ambushed. What Richard failed to understand was that his revelation wasn't occurring in a vacuum. It was disrupting an entire ecosystem of relationships that had found their balance over decades. This impulse toward late-life disclosure often emerges from a misunderstanding of psychological healing. Catharsis, the purging of emotional content, has been wildly overvalued in popular psychology. The research is quite clear. Venting without resolution often reinforces neural pathways rather than releasing them. You're not extinguishing the fire, you're rehearsing it, strengthening those very circuits of resentment. The older mind has a particular tendency toward rumination, the repeated cycling through of past injuries. It's a neurological pattern that intensifies with age as the prefrontal systems that inhibit negative thoughts begin to lose some efficiency. What feels like finally telling the truth is often just this rumination finding a broader audience. And that audience includes people who depend on you for stability, not historical grievances. There's a Jungian concept worth considering here. The shadow material we carry isn't meant for casual disclosure. It requires intentional integration, often with professional guidance. When you share unprocessed resentment with family, you're essentially asking them to help carry your shadow, a burden that distorts their own relationship not just with you but with the entire family system. Instead, consider what I call directed disclosure. This means finding appropriate context for processing these long-standing conflicts. Therapy provides a contained environment. Men's groups specifically for seniors offer perspective from peers who understand the generational context. Spiritual advisors trained in reconciliation work can guide the process toward actual resolution rather than mere ventilation. The family dinner table is rarely the appropriate venue for excavating decades-old wounds. Your family gathers with you seeking connection, not historical correction. And once certain statements enter the family narrative, they cannot be easily withdrawn. Words create reality in family systems. The momentary relief you might feel can trigger years of unnecessary pain for others. What's particularly tragic is how these disclosures often distort your legacy. I've worked with families where a patriarch's lifetime of wisdom and contribution became overshadowed by a single evening of bitter disclosures. The human mind gives disproportionate weight to negative information. It's called the negativity bias in cognitive psychology. One evening of unleashed resentment can recolor decades of positive memories. This doesn't mean suppression that creates its own pathologies. It means discernment about context, timing, and purpose. Ask yourself, will this disclosure lead to meaningful resolution or merely emotional unburdening at others' expense? If it's the latter, you've identified a boundary worth maintaining. The constant sharing of health anxieties represents perhaps the most subtle boundary violation because it seems so natural, even expected for men in their senior years to discuss their physical challenges. Yet I've observed a critical distinction between appropriate health discussions and what becomes a form of unintentional self-sabotage through excessive disclosure. I worked with Malcolm, 73, whose conversations had gradually transformed into detailed catalogs of symptoms, doctor visits, and medication adjustments. He didn't notice how his children's eyes would shift from engagement to concealed concern, how his grandchildren began to define him by his ailments rather than his wisdom. Most critically, he didn't recognize how this habitual focus was reshaping his own identity, from the accomplished architect he'd been to a collection of medical conditions. What's happening psychologically is profound. Every time you articulate a health concern, you're not merely describing reality, you're constructing it. The narratives we repeatedly verbalize become self-reinforcing cognitive frameworks. Neurologically speaking, you're strengthening neural pathways that heighten attention to symptoms. The brain follows focus. When your daily conversations center on physical decline, your perceptual systems become hypervigilant to every bodily sensation. This isn't abstract theory, it's embodied reality. Studies in psychoneuroimmunology demonstrate how our narratives influence physiological functioning. The nocebo effect, essentially the negative version of the placebo effect, shows that negative expectations about health can actually manifest as measurable physical symptoms. Your words aren't just describing your health, they're partially creating your experience of it. Consider instead what I call strategic health disclosure. This means being selectively forthcoming about medical information based on actual necessity rather than conversational habit. Your adult daughter needs to know about significant diagnoses or medication changes that might require support. She doesn't need the daily barometer reading of your joint pain or digestive fluctuations. The family context magnifies this effect because of role expectations. For decades, you've likely been the protector, the one who fixed problems rather than becoming one. When you transform into a catalog of medical concerns, you're inadvertently signaling a fundamental identity shift that creates anxiety throughout the family system. Your adult children begin the psychological process of role reversal, moving from protected to protector, often years before such a transition is actually necessary. What's particularly insidious is how this pattern creates a feedback loop. The more you share health anxieties, the more your family responds with concern. Their concern reinforces your focus on symptoms. The increased symptom awareness leads to more sharing. Before long, your primary identity within the family becomes that of the aging father with health problems rather than the complex, capable man you continue to be. The deeper insight is that selective disclosure about health isn't self-deception, it's self-preservation. It protects not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. Identity is partly maintained through social feedback loops. When every conversation revolves around physical decline, that narrative begins to colonize your self-concept in ways that accelerate the very decline you fear. None of this means denying medical realities or avoiding necessary care. It means recognizing that constant verbalization of health concerns serves neither you nor your family. It means understanding that some aspects of aging are best processed with medical professionals, age-appropriate peer groups, or support communities specifically designed for health challenges. The sharing of disappointments about other family members represents one of the most destructive boundary violations, particularly because it often begins with seemingly innocent conversations. I've watched numerous family systems fracture when patriarchs believed they were simply comparing notes or getting perspective about one family member from another. What they failed to recognize was the insidious nature of triangulation. David, 70, came to me bewildered by the sudden tension in his family. He couldn't understand why his son had become distant after learning that David had been discussing his parenting approaches with his daughter-in-law. "I was just trying to help," he explained. What David had inadvertently created was a triangulated communication pattern that undermined his son's authority in his own household and violated the boundary between generations. This pattern becomes increasingly tempting in your senior years for psychologically understandable reasons. As your direct authority naturally diminishes, there's an unconscious pull toward indirect influence. Speaking about family members rather than to them creates an illusion of control while actually diminishing your moral authority within the family structure. It's what family systems theorists call emotional triangulation, and it's corrosive to trust. What's happening at a deeper level relates to psychological boundaries. Each family subsystem, the marital relationship, the parent-child relationship, the sibling relationship, requires its own integrity to function properly. When you share criticisms or disappointments about one family member with another, you're essentially breaching these subsystem boundaries. You're asking one person to hold the emotional content that rightfully belongs in a direct relationship with another. Consider instead what I call direct engagement. This means having potentially uncomfortable conversations directly with the involved party, rather than processing those feelings through triangulated discussions. Yes, it's more challenging. Yes, it requires more emotional regulation. But it's the only approach that preserves both your integrity and the structural integrity of the family system you've spent decades building. The family hierarchies that worked when your children were young have fundamentally changed. Your adult children now have their own family systems with boundaries that deserve respect. When you circumvent these boundaries by discussing your son with your daughter-in-law, or your daughter with her husband, you're not building closeness, you're undermining the very autonomy you work to instill in them. What's particularly destructive about this pattern is how it damages trust across multiple relationships simultaneously. When your son discovers you've been discussing his parenting with his wife, he feels betrayed by both of you. His wife feels caught between loyalties. The boundaries that allow healthy intimacy in their marriage become compromised. And perhaps most importantly, your moral authority, which now rests primarily on wisdom rather than position, suffers irreparable damage. The deeper truth is that family harmony in your senior years depends not on control but on respect, particularly respect for appropriate boundaries. The patriarch who understands this shifts from directive authority to something far more powerful, modeling integrity through direct communication. When disappointment arises, and it inevitably will, address it directly with the person involved, rather than processing it through other family relationships. This doesn't mean isolation with your concerns. Professional support from therapists who specialize in late-life family dynamics can provide perspective without the damage of triangulation. Age-appropriate peer groups offer wisdom from those navigating similar challenges. These contexts allow processing without boundary violations. The ultimate insight is that family peace in your senior years depends less on agreement than on communication patterns that preserve dignity and autonomy. By maintaining strict boundaries around discussing family members with other family members, you're not being less intimate, you're creating the preconditions for genuine intimacy based on trust, rather than manipulation. The sharing of personal doubts and existential questions represents perhaps the most complex boundary of all, particularly for men in their senior years who were raised in an era where stoicism was equated with strength. I've observed a cultural pendulum swing where total emotional disclosure is now celebrated without discernment. This creates a particular vulnerability for senior men navigating life's profound final questions. William, 76, began openly sharing his deepest fears about mortality, legacy, and life's meaning with his adult children during weekly family dinners. He believed this radical honesty would bring them closer. Instead, it created a subtle but unmistakable anxiety that permeated their gatherings. His grandchildren became uncomfortable. His children felt unprepared to hold such weighty concerns. Most importantly, William found that casual environments diluted questions that deserved sacred space. What's happening psychologically is nuanced. Existential questions about meaning, legacy, and mortality represent what Jung called encounters with the transcendent function. They're not casual conversational material. When you bring these profound inner explorations into everyday family interactions, you're unintentionally diminishing their significance while simultaneously burdening relationships that aren't structured to hold such content. This is particularly relevant for men who spent decades as the family's emotional anchor. When you suddenly transform from harbor to storm, it creates a form of psychological vertigo for the entire family system. Your adult children still carry the imprint of you as the secure base from which they ventured into the world. When that base appears to be questioning its own foundations, it triggers primitive attachment anxiety that no amount of rational understanding can fully resolve. Consider instead what I call contextual disclosure. This means matching the depth of your existential questioning to appropriate settings. Certainly, some philosophical reflections can enrich family conversations when offered thoughtfully. But your deepest wrestling with meaning, mortality, and legacy requires specialized contexts. Spiritual communities designed for late-life questioning, philosophical discussion groups with peers facing similar transitions, or therapeutic relationships specifically oriented toward existential concerns. The family context carries particular limitations for these discussions because of role expectations. For decades, you've likely been the one with answers rather than questions. While some evolution of this dynamic is natural and appropriate, complete role reversal creates instability in the family emotional system. Your adult children may respond with problem-solving, dismissal, or anxiety, none of which serves the depth of engagement these questions deserve. What's particularly tragic is how inappropriate disclosure often leads to diminished exploration. When William received uncomfortable responses to his existential questions, he didn't find more appropriate venues, he simply stopped asking. The questions didn't disappear, they went underground, creating a subtle despair that was ultimately more isolating than the appropriate boundaries would have been. The deeper insight is that protecting certain inner territories isn't withholding, it's discernment. Some of life's most profound questions aren't meant for casual disclosure. They require specialized language, conceptual frameworks, and settings that honor their significance. Spiritual traditions across cultures have always recognized this, creating specific contexts for engaging with life's ultimate questions outside ordinary social interaction. None of this means isolation with your deepest concerns. It means matching the depth of your questioning with contexts designed to hold it. Philosophical reading groups, spiritual communities, therapeutic relationships focused on meaning-making, or deep friendships with peers engaged in similar inner work. These settings allow exploration without the complications that arise from burdening family relationships with questions they aren't structured to address. The ultimate wisdom is recognizing that boundaries around your inner sanctuary aren't walls. They're membranes, selectively permeable based on context and relationship. Some of your existential questioning may indeed enrich family conversations when offered as wisdom rather than worry. But your deepest wrestling belongs in contexts that can truly honor its significance, for your sake and for the sake of those who rely on your steady presence in their lives. These boundaries I've outlined aren't arbitrary restrictions, they're the invisible architecture of dignity in your final chapters. The quality of your remaining years depends less on circumstances than on these precise decisions about what deserves protection. Family harmony isn't achieved through total transparency. It's cultivated through the wisdom of selective disclosure. The alternative is clear. Continued erosion of your standing, unnecessary family anxiety, and the slow dissolution of relationships you've spent decades building. Remember that chaos isn't just external. It begins in the collapse of proper boundaries. Order starts with you, with these 5 deliberate choices about what remains sacred. Ask yourself, will you surrender the authority of your remaining years for the temporary relief of unburdened disclosure, or will you shoulder the responsibility of discernment? Your family doesn't need your unfiltered experience, they need your wisdom.